That's a grand fish, Sandy.
That's a nice
What about
fish.
a dram?
I don't mind over here, Dromie. Here's still the next in, then.
Isn't it grand that this stuff's made in Scotland?
Aye, but that's gay true.
Yes, Scotch whisky is the true product of Scotland. If your steps should take you into the Speyside district of the Highlands, you will come across distillery after distillery in which the first stages of turning barley into whisky are performed. It's a fascinating story. Let's begin at the beginning. The barley comes to the distillery by train or lorry from the local farmer. It is stored in the barley loft, and in this shot there seems to be plenty of it. But there have been years in which barley has been scarce due to wartime controls, and the effects of such scarcity are felt long, long afterwards. The first process starts when the barley is steeped in water for about 60 hours. The action of water and of heat on the barley, when it's spread out on the malting floor, is to cause it to germinate, which is the outward and visible sign of the changing of starch into sugar inside the ear of barley. While the sprouting barley lies on the malting floor, it is constantly turned by men with wooden shovels. If you stoop down and pick up a handful of barley from the loft before it is steeped, it looks like this under the magnifying glass. After being steeped in water, you can plainly see the germination or sprouting. The first process, the malting process, is not complete. The growth of the barley has to be stopped before it goes too far, so it is dried in a kiln. The kiln is easy to pick out in a distillery from the pagoda-like top, which is as conspicuous as the oast house is in a hop garden. Both buildings perform the same functions. There's a furnace below the kiln which is served with both coke and peat. The aroma of the peat, which is imparted to the barley during this drying stage, eventually gives character to the whisky. Up in the kiln itself, men are turning over the drying malt amidst the aroma of the peat reek, as it's called. The floor being perforated allows the heat to rise through it. After this, the malt, as the dry barley has now become, is stored in hoppers, ready for the next stage. This next stage begins with an enclosed mill in which the malt is crushed before passing into what is known as the mash tun. It pours in, looking rather like porridge, for water heated to 146 degrees Fahrenheit has been added. Rotating arms keep the mixture swirling. At the end of an hour or so, the sugar has been dissolved into a liquid which is now known as worts. The draff, or solid remnant of the ground barley, remains in the mash tun and is removed from it by a conveyor. This draff is valuable for feeding cattle. About 26% of the barley employed is recovered for this economically important purpose. The valuable sugary solution of the barley, now known as worts, passes through a cooling process and in due course goes to the next stage, that of fermentation. In this large tun room, not to be confused with the mash tun, are 8 vessels, some of them full, some of them awaiting their turn. In the empty vessel, a man is dwarfed, and if left over long, may join the spirits. The Duke of Clarence died that way in a butt, but, he selected Malmsey wine. The full vessels contain the worts and an important addition, yeast. Look at the encyclopedia for a technical description of yeast. For our practical purposes, it's enough to state this, that yeast, part animal, part vegetable, is the agent of fermentation. It turns sugar into alcohol, and its methods are sometimes violent. The liquid bubbles up, and a head is created which has to be controlled by a switcher or rotating arm so that it won't overflow the vessels. Up to this point, the processes have been almost similar to those used in brewing. But now we reach the crux of the operations, distilling. And by this time, the state, through its agent, the Customs and Excise Department, is taking a very full interest in proceedings. Distilling, of course, means the heating of liquid until it becomes vapor, then cooling it until it becomes liquid again. During the process, a separation of water from spirit takes place, which makes the last stage distinctly more powerful than the first. In the shape of the stills, resembling a giant pot, may reside the secret virtue of Scotch whisky. Why the bobbin? The sound of its tap on the casing indicates to the still man that the wash, or fermented wort, is not rising too high and choking the neck of the still. At the back of the stills outside the building stand the worm cooling tubs, where the neck of the still is carried down in a spiral coil through cold water. The cold water causes the vapor which is being fed through the pipes to become liquid again. Notice the economical use of water power on the adjacent water wheel. Back inside the still house again to observe that whisky is distilled twice. Only the cream of the cream reaches the consumer. And here is the cream passing through the spirit safe. On the left, the distillation of the first still, which is going to be distilled again. In the center, the fully distilled whisky. Yes, this is it, real whisky. On the right, the gauges for testing the strength. Hundreds of casks lying beside the distillery, waiting to be filled. For, as everybody knows, whisky has to mature, and the maturing takes place over a period of years in carefully selected and skillfully coopered casks. The cooper, to be sure, is a very important member of the distillery staff. The casks are filled in a special building, sometimes known as the spirit store, but here called a duty-free warehouse. The door is fastened by two locks, one controlled by the excise department, the other by the distillery management. From the spirit vat, which stands at the rear of the store, the casks are filled with the new whisky. Samples are taken from each cask, and from the specific gravity, the amount of proof spirit is calculated by customs officer and distillery manager.
$60.51.2.
60.51.2, 11.2 overbrew.
Then the quantities in each butt and hogshead are called out, with the excise officer checking the figures to make sure that all weights, identities and other particulars are correct.
51 and 4, 54 and 4, 54 and a half, 55, 52 and 4, 54 3 quarters, 68 3 quarters, 59 and 4, 53 3 quarters.
And presently the casks are rolled down to the storage warehouses. Now here's the place for the connoisseur, the warehouse. Hundreds of casks stacked and mellowing. As for connoisseurs, every distilleryman is a connoisseur in the sense of being an expert. A tap on the cask tells the expert here whether it's still sound or not. That is the reason for the tapping, to make sure the casks are sound. There seems to be plenty of whisky here, but the trouble is that you can't drink your whisky and keep it. And owing to the big demand over the war years and the restriction on the production, a rationing had to be voluntarily imposed by the distillers.
Proper good stuff.
Some go back to 1922, but the average age of whisky used in blends is about 8 to 10 years old. When it reaches this advanced age, it comes out of its distillery warehouse. Here are a couple of casks being regauged and prepared for dispatch, with the excise officer and distillery staff again, as ever, in friendly cooperation.
3216.
36 of 38, 109, 33, 2, 31, 6.
Right up. Carry on.
And that closes the chapter on distilling. Outside a large blending and bottling plant, for we've taken a big leap from the glens to the blending centres. And please imagine, as we open up the doors with the customary routine, that a period of years has elapsed since you saw the stuff being distilled earlier in the picture. Casks containing the matured spirit are being rolled onto the blending floor for the beginning of the final process, which will convert the contents into the familiar bottled Scotch. Products of many different distilleries contribute to the final blend. The bungs are withdrawn and samples are taken to satisfy the blender that the whisky is up to standard and uncontaminated by any foreign matter. Watch the methods of the experienced old blender who carries out the test in his sample room. Believe it or not, it's nose as does it. Again, the specific gravity is checked by hydrometer. Now the unlocking of pump valves under supervision of an excise officer. There are two series of blending vats fed by stout pipes. Into troughs serving these pipeways, the whisky from the selected casks is emptied. The blending vats, into which the whisky is poured, stand in their own warehouse and may contain as much as 21,000 gallons. Only the tops of the vats can be shown. Blending, incidentally, is a specialized process identified with each blender. The various whiskies from different distilleries settle down and blend themselves amiably in the vats. And of course, as at every stage in whisky production, samples are taken to ensure the highest quality. And now the valves are unlocked below the main blending vat for the liquid to flow out and down the outlet pipes, for once again the blended whisky has to be filled into casks to go through the marrying process. Another picture, therefore, of filling casks. And weighing them. Another picture, too, of casks maturing in a warehouse, and of a cooper tapping them for soundness of the cask. There may seem a lot of repetition in telling our story, but the recurrence of similar scenes is inevitable, to show the care and scrupulousness applied at every turn. However, this is the last our whisky will see of wood, for blending is complete and it's ready for bottling. Bungs are withdrawn, the contents of each cask are measured by the excise officer. Then the spirit is poured into troughs again. It is then carried to bottling vats, which can be observed at the back of the large room where bottling is in progress. Every other operation in whisky production has been slow and gradual to achieve that smooth perfection which is the hallmark of Scotch whisky. Bottling, by contrast, is a rapid process. The final superb article, as perfect as care and consistency can make it, has been produced in bulk. Now all that remains is to break it down into small quantities and distribute it to customers. Capping is another mechanical operation, self-explanatory too. But note the special care with which each bottle is examined under a powerful inspection light. More machinery attaches the labels under supervision. The trademark on these labels is absent, for the Scotch Whisky Association present this film as the story of whisky production, not as an advertisement for any particular blend. Wrapped and packed into cases, the bottles are ready for delivery to the retail merchants. Or for export. But it all starts up on Speyside, up in the clear highland air of the peat-covered moors, where the waters of the Livet tumble quietly over their ancient rocks, and the hereditary skill of the Scottish distillery man is applied with conscientious efficiency to his superb craft. And it is a superb craft, for, as the fisherman said to the gilly, there are a few articles in this civilized existence which stand out as perfect examples of their kind.
And Scotch whisky is one of them.